No one selected her until she looked at a human and said, "Will you be my husband?" Best HFY Stories, The Last Ride to Silver Creek. The bullet tore through Jack Morgan's hat before he even heard the shot. He dove behind the water trough as 3 more rounds splintered the wooden post beside his head. His horse reared and bolted down the dusty street of Redemption Falls, leaving him stranded in the middle of a gunfight he hadn't started. 2 men were shooting from the saloon across the street. Jack recognized the taller one, a gunslinger named Cole Briggs who rode with the Dalton gang. The other was a stranger, but his aim was just as deadly. Jack rolled to his left and came up firing, his revolver barking twice. The stranger jerked backward and disappeared inside the saloon. Cole ducked behind a barrel and shouted something Jack couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Then more shots came from the general store to Jack's right. He was caught in a crossfire with nowhere to run. The water trough wouldn't hold much longer. Already water was leaking from 6 bullet holes. Jack had ridden into town looking for supplies, nothing more. He'd been tracking the Dalton gang for 3 weeks, ever since they'd robbed the bank in Silver Creek and killed the sheriff. That sheriff had been Jack's brother, Danny Morgan, and Jack had sworn on his grave to bring every last member of the gang to justice. But someone had warned them. Someone had told the gang that Jack was coming. He fired 3 quick shots at the general store, then sprinted across the street toward an alley. Bullets kicked up dirt at his heels. He made it to cover just as hat flew off again, this time with a hole clean through the crown. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the wall and reloaded. From deeper in the alley, a woman's voice called out, "This way, quickly." Jack turned to see a young woman in a blue dress waving frantically from a doorway. He had no choice but to trust her. He ran down the alley as more gunshots echoed behind him. The woman pulled him inside a small building that smelled of flour and coffee. It was the back entrance to a bakery. "They've been waiting for you since yesterday," she said, bolting the door. "I'm Katie Sullivan. My father owns this place." "How many are there?" Jack asked, checking his ammunition. He had 8 bullets left. At least 6 in town. Maybe more outside. "They've got men watching every road." Katie moved to the window and peered through the curtain. "You're the one hunting them, aren't you?" "The one they call Morgan?" Jack nodded. "They murdered my brother." "They've murdered a lot of people," Katie said quietly. "My father tried to stand up to them last month. They beat him so badly he still can't walk right." Jack moved to the other window. Through the dusty glass, he could see 2 riders circling the building. They knew where he was. It was only a matter of time before they came through the door. "Is there another way out?" he asked. Katie shook her head. "Just the front and the back, but there's a root cellar under the kitchen. We could hide there. Hiding won't help. They'll burn this place down if they have to." Jack checked his gun again. 8 bullets against 6 men, maybe more. The odds weren't good, but he'd faced worse. A loud crash came from the front of the bakery. Someone was breaking down the door. Katie grabbed a shotgun from behind the counter and stood beside Jack. Her hands were shaking, but her jaw was set with determination. "Can you shoot that thing?" Jack asked. "I grew up hunting rabbits with my brother," she replied. "I can shoot." The front door splintered open and Cole Briggs stepped inside, flanked by 2 more gunmen. They spread out, their weapons drawn. Cole smiled when he saw Jack. "Morgan," he said, "you've led us on quite a chase. But it ends here." Jack raised his revolver. "It ends when you're all dead or hanging from a rope." Cole laughed. "Big words from a dead man. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Drop your weapon, and maybe we'll make it quick." "Come and take it," Jack said. The bakery erupted in gunfire. Jack's first shot caught one of the gunmen in the shoulder, spinning him around. Katie's shotgun roared, and the second gunman went down hard. But Cole was fast. He fired twice, and Jack felt a burning pain in his left arm. He dove behind the counter as more bullets tore through the walls. Katie scrambled beside him, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She reloaded the shotgun with practiced speed. Jack wrapped a cloth around his bleeding arm and prepared for the next assault. Through the smoke and dust, he could hear Cole calling for reinforcements. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Jack Morgan wasn't the kind of man who gave up, and he wasn't about to start now. The fight for Silver Creek had just begun, and before it was done, the streets of Redemption Falls would run red with the blood of the guilty. Jack had made a promise to his brother, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. The Dalton gang had made their last mistake when they'd come after him. Now they would learn what it meant to cross a Morgan. Katie looked at him with wide eyes. "What do we do now?" Jack smiled grimly and checked his remaining bullets. "We fight, and we don't stop fighting until every last one of them is in the ground or behind bars. That's what we do." Outside, more horses arrived. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk told Jack that Cole's reinforcements had come. The bakery was surrounded, and there was no way out except through a wall of guns and outlaws who wanted him dead. Jack took a deep breath and said a silent prayer for his brother's soul. Then he stood up, ready to face whatever came next, because some things were worth dying for, and justice was at the top of that list. The shooting started again, louder this time, and Jack Morgan met it head on. Cole Briggs crouched behind an overturned table, blood seeping from a graze on his cheek. He hadn't expected the woman to fight back, and he certainly hadn't expected her to be that good with a shotgun. Brrr! Burn them out, Cole shouted to his men outside. I want Morgan dead before sundown. But before anyone could move, a new sound cut through the chaos. Horses. Lots of them, coming fast from the north end of town. It couldn't be the law. Not out here. Redemption Falls didn't have a sheriff anymore, not since the last one had accidentally fallen down a well with a bullet in his back. Through the broken door, Cole saw a sight that made his blood run cold. At least a dozen riders were thundering down the main street, and leading them was a man wearing a marshal's badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was Marshal Frank Hayes from the territorial capital, and he'd brought a full posse with him. Jack heard the horses, too. He risked a glance out the window and felt a surge of hope. He'd sent word to the marshal 3 days ago, but he hadn't expected help to arrive so soon. Frank Hayes was a legend in these parts, a lawman who'd cleaned up some of the worst towns in the territory. If anyone could take down the Dalton gang, it was him. Cole realized his mistake too late. He'd put all his men in town, leaving the roads unwatched while they focused on Jack. Now they were trapped between Morgan and the law. He made a split-second decision and ran for the back door, his remaining men following close behind. Jack burst out of the bakery just as Cole and 3 others mounted their horses in the alley. He fired twice, hitting one rider and causing another to lose control of his mount. But Cole spurred his horse hard and raced toward the edge of town with 2 companions. "They're running!" Jack shouted to the approaching posse, headed west toward the canyon. Marshal Hayes pulled up beside him, his weathered face grim. "You must be Morgan. Got your message about the Dalton gang. Looks like we got here just in time." "Cole Briggs is getting away," Jack said, pointing at the dust cloud rising in the distance. "He's their second in command. If we lose him, we'll never find out where they're hiding." The marshal nodded and turned to his men. "Half of you stay here and round up whoever's left. The rest of you, with me. We're going after Briggs." Jack grabbed a horse from the hitching post and swung into the saddle despite the pain in his wounded arm. Katie ran out of the bakery, the shotgun still in her hands. "Take this," she said, handing him a canteen, "and be careful." Jack nodded his thanks and kicked his horse into a gallop. The posse thundered out of town, a cloud of dust marking their passage. Cole had maybe a 5-minute head start, but his horse would be tired from standing in the sun all day. Jack's mount was fresh, and he pushed it hard, leaning low over its neck as they raced across the open prairie. The land here was rough and broken, filled with gullies and rocky outcrops. Perfect country for an ambush. Jack kept his eyes moving, scanning every shadow and hollow. Cole was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. They'd been riding for 20 minutes when Jack spotted movement ahead. 3 riders were pushing their horses up a steep trail toward Red Rock Canyon. The canyon was a maze of narrow passages and dead ends, a place where a man could lose himself forever if he knew the way. Marshal Hayes pulled up beside Jack. "That canyon's a death trap. If they get in there, we might never find them." "Then we don't let them get in there," Jack said, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. He took aim at the lead rider, accounting for the distance and the movement. His first shot missed, but the second one struck the trailing horse. The animal stumbled and went down, throwing its rider hard against the rocks. The other 2 riders disappeared into the canyon entrance. Jack and the marshal reached the fallen man seconds later. It wasn't Cole, but one of his gang members, a young kid who couldn't have been more than 20. He was conscious but badly hurt, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Where's Briggs headed?" Marshal Hayes demanded. The kid spat blood and glared at them. "Go to hell. You're looking at a hanging either way," the marshal said. "But if you cooperate, maybe the judge will show mercy." The kid's defiance crumbled. Pain and fear won out over loyalty. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles in. The gang's been using it as a hideout. That's where Cole's going. That's where they all are." Jack felt his pulse quicken. The entire Dalton gang, all in one place. This was the break he'd been waiting for. But it also meant they'd be riding into a hornet's nest. The gang wouldn't go down easy. The marshal left 2 men to guard the wounded outlaw and tend to his injuries. Then he led the rest of the posse into the canyon. The walls rose high on either side, red sandstone that glowed like fire in the late afternoon sun. Their horses' hooves echoed off the rock, making it impossible to move quietly. Jack rode near the front, his rifle ready. Every bend in the trail could hide an ambush. Every boulder could conceal a gunman. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. They rode deeper into the canyon, following the trail that wound between towering cliffs. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows crossing the ground like dark omens. Jack thought about his brother Danny, about the telegram that had brought him the news. Danny had been a good man, a fair sheriff who'd tried to give everyone a chance. The Dalton gang had shot him down in cold blood while he'd been trying to protect an elderly woman from being robbed. A shot rang out, echoing through the canyon like thunder. One of the posse members cried out and clutched his shoulder. Jack spotted the muzzle flash from a ledge 50 feet above them. He fired back, and a body tumbled from the rocks, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. "Ambush!" the marshal shouted. "Take cover!" The posse scattered, diving behind rocks and into shallow depressions. More shots came from above and ahead, a withering crossfire that had them pinned down. Jack could see at least 4 shooters, maybe more. The Dalton gang had turned the canyon into a killing field. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed the posse would panic and retreat. Instead, Marshal Hayes was a veteran of a dozen range wars. He split his men into 2 groups, sending one to climb the eastern wall and flank the shooters while the other provided covering fire. Jack went with the climbing group. His wounded arm screamed in protest as he pulled himself up the steep slope, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. The rocks were loose and treacherous, and twice he nearly lost his footing. Below him, the sound of gunfire was constant, a rolling thunder that never seemed to stop. They reached the top of the ridge and worked their way along the rim. Jack could see the shooters now, focused on the men below, completely unaware of the threat from above. He signaled the others, and they spread out, taking careful aim. "Now," Jack whispered, and they all fired at once. 3 of the outlaws went down immediately. The 4th spun around, his eyes wide with shock, and raised his hands in surrender. The gunfight was over in seconds. With the ambush broken, the posse moved forward again. The trail opened up into a wide box canyon with steep walls on 3 sides, and there, in the middle of a crude camp, were the remaining members of the Dalton gang. Jack counted 8 men, including Cole Briggs and a tall man with a black beard who had to be Frank Dalton himself. They'd heard the shooting and were already mounted, ready to make a run for it. But there was nowhere to go. The posse blocked the only exit, and the canyon walls were too steep to climb on horseback. "We're not going to hang," he shouted. "You want us, you'll have to kill us." "That can be arranged," Marshal Hayes called back. "But I'd rather take you alive. You've got one chance to surrender. Take it or die." For a long moment, nobody moved. Jack could see the calculations running through Dalton's mind. Fight and die, or surrender and face the noose. Either way, the outcome was the same. But surrendering meant a few more days of life, a slim chance at escape, maybe even a miracle. Cole Briggs made the decision for everyone. He raised his gun and fired at the marshal. The shot went wide, but it shattered the fragile standoff. The canyon erupted in violence. Jack dove behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. He came up shooting, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. One of the gang members toppled from his horse. Another wheeled his mount around and tried to break through the posse line, but 3 rifles spoke as one, and he went down hard. The fight was brutal and close. Jack's rifle clicked empty, and he drew his revolver. A bearded outlaw charged at him on foot, firing wildly. Jack shot him twice in the chest. The man's momentum carried him forward, and he collapsed at Jack's feet, his eyes already glazing over. Through the smoke and chaos, Jack saw Cole Briggs trying to escape on foot. Scrambling up a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, Jack holstered his gun and went after him, his boots slipping on the loose rock. Cole looked back and fired twice, forcing Jack to duck. But the outlaw's gun clicked empty, and he threw it aside with a curse. They reached a narrow ledge 50 feet above the canyon floor. Cole turned to face Jack, a knife gleaming in his hand. "Just you and me now, Morgan. The way it should be." Jack drew his own knife. His left arm was nearly useless, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, but his right arm was strong, and his anger burned hotter than the desert sun. This man had helped kill his brother. This man would pay. They circled each other on the narrow ledge, boots scraping against stone. Cole lunged first, his blade slashing at Jack's throat. Jack stepped back and countered, his knife scoring a line across Cole's ribs. The outlaw grunted but didn't slow down. He was fast and he was skilled, and Jack realized this wasn't going to be easy. They traded blows, steel ringing against steel. Jack's wounded arm was weakening fast, and he could feel his strength draining away with each passing second. Cole sensed it too and pressed harder, driving Jack back toward the edge of the ledge. Jack's boot heel slipped on loose gravel. For a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling for balance. Cole saw his chance and lunged forward, knife raised for a killing blow. But Jack wasn't finished yet. He let himself fall backward, grabbing Cole's shirt as he went. They both tumbled over the edge, locked together, falling through empty air. Jack twisted hard, using Cole's body as a cushion. They hit the ground with bone-jarring force. Cole took the worst of it, his skull cracking against a flat rock. Jack rolled away, gasping for breath. Every part of his body hurt, but he was alive. Cole Briggs lay motionless on the ground, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. The fall had broken his neck. Marshall Hayes ran over and helped Jack to his feet. "That was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. You could have been killed." "I was already as good as dead," Jack said, looking around the canyon. The fight was over. Bodies littered the ground, most of them wearing the rough clothes and dusty boots of outlaws. Frank Dalton lay dead near his horse, 3 bullets in his chest. The Dalton gang was finished. "We got them all," the marshal said. "Your brother can rest easy now." Jack nodded, too exhausted to speak. It was done. The gang that had terrorized the territory for 2 years was wiped out. Justice had been served, though the cost had been high. 3 posse members were wounded, and 1 would likely lose his arm to infection. But they'd won. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of orange and purple, Jack thought about Silver Creek. He thought about his brother's grave on the hill overlooking the town. He thought about all the people the Dalton gang had hurt, all the lives they'd destroyed, and he felt a grim satisfaction knowing that it was finally over. The posse began the long task of gathering the bodies and securing the camp. They found stolen money, jewelry, and dozens of items taken from robberies across 3 territories. There was enough evidence to fill a wagon, enough to put the Dalton gang's crimes in the history books. Jack sat on a rock and let a deputy bandage his arm properly. The wound was deep but clean. It would heal with time. Katie Sullivan had been right to help him. If she hadn't pulled him into that bakery, he'd be dead in the street of Redemption Falls. He made a mental note to thank her properly when they got back to town. "What will you do now?" Marshall Hayes asked, sitting down beside him. Jack looked up at the darkening sky. "I don't know. I've been chasing this gang for so long, I haven't thought about what comes after. You've got a gift for tracking and a steady hand in a fight," the marshal said. "Territory could use more men like you. I could put in a word with the governor, get you a badge if you're interested." Jack considered it. He'd never thought about becoming a lawman. He'd been a rancher before Danny's death, content to work his land and live a quiet life. But that life seemed impossibly far away now. The man who'd left his ranch 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone harder and colder. "I'll think about it," Jack said finally. They camped in the canyon that night, posting guards and tending to the wounded. Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men he'd killed. He told himself they deserved it, that they'd been murderers and thieves who'd terrorized innocent people. But that didn't make it any easier. In the morning, they began the long ride back to Redemption Falls. They had to move slowly because of the wounded men and the bodies they were bringing back. Jack rode at the rear of the column, lost in his thoughts. When they finally reached town 2 days later, it seemed like the entire population had turned out to greet them. News of the fight had spread fast, carried by a rider who'd left the canyon early to report their success. People lined the street, cheering and clapping as the posse rode past. Katie Sullivan was waiting outside her father's bakery. Her face lit up when she saw Jack, and she ran to meet him as he dismounted. "You're alive," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When they said there'd been a big fight in the canyon, I was so worried." "It's over," Jack said. "The Dalton gang is finished." Katie threw her arms around him, and Jack found himself holding her tight, grateful for the warmth of another human being after all the death and violence. When they finally pulled apart, he saw tears in her eyes. "My father wants to thank you," she said. "He's been baking all morning, preparing a feast for you and the marshal's men." "The whole town is celebrating." Jack nodded, but he didn't feel much like celebrating. Too many people had died. Too much blood had been spilled. Justice had been served, but the cost weighed heavy on his soul. The next few days passed in a blur. There was a funeral for the posse member who died from his wounds. There were statements to give and reports to file. The territorial governor sent a telegram praising Marshall Hayes and his men for their bravery. Jack's name was mentioned prominently, and several newspapers sent reporters to interview him. He hated the attention. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd done what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. On the 5th day after their return, Marshal Hayes found Jack sitting on the porch of the boarding house where he'd been staying. The lawman had a letter in his hand. From the governor, he said, handing it to Jack. He's offering you a position as a deputy marshal. Good pay, steady work, and a chance to make a real difference in the territory. What do you say? Jack read the letter slowly. It was a generous offer, more than he'd expected. But something held him back. He'd spent the last month consumed by thoughts of revenge and justice. Now that it was done, he felt empty inside, like a well that had run dry. I need some time to think, he said. There's something I have to do first. The marshal understood. Take all the time you need. The offer will stand. That afternoon, Jack rode out of Redemption Falls. He headed east toward Silver Creek, toward his brother's grave. The town was still rebuilding from the bank robbery. Many buildings bore scars from the gang's violence. But the people were resilient. They were putting their lives back together, piece by piece. Jack dismounted at the small cemetery on the hill. Danny's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross. Someone had planted wildflowers around it, and they were blooming despite the harsh sun. Jack knelt beside the grave and placed his hat over his heart. It's done, Danny, he said quietly. Every last one of them. They'll never hurt anyone again. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Jack stayed there for a long time, talking to his brother, telling him about the chase and the fight in the canyon, telling him about Katie Sullivan and Marshal Hayes, and the offer to become a lawman. When he finally stood up, the sun was setting. Jack looked out over Silver Creek, at the town his brother had died protecting. He thought about all the other towns in the territory, all the people who needed someone to stand between them and the outlaws who preyed on the weak. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be a rancher anymore. Maybe his path lay in a different direction now. Maybe Danny's death had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Jack put his hat back on and walked to his horse. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the saddle, looking back at the grave. Then he swung up into the saddle and turned his horse toward Redemption Falls. He had a letter to write to the governor. He had a future to figure out. And he had a promise to keep, not just to his brother, but to all the innocent people who needed someone to fight for them. As he rode through the gathering darkness, Jack Morgan felt something shift inside him. The rage that had driven him for so long was fading, replaced by something quieter but no less powerful. Purpose. Determination. Sense that his life had meaning beyond revenge. The last ride to Silver Creek was over. But Jack had a feeling that his real journey was just beginning. There were more outlaws out there, more people who needed help, more wrongs to be set right. And now he had the skills and the will to do something about it. He thought about Katie Sullivan waiting back in Redemption Falls. He thought about Marshal Hayes and the men who'd fought beside him in the canyon. He thought about the badge the governor was offering him and what it would mean to wear it. By the time he reached the edge of town, Jack had made his decision. He would accept the governor's offer. He would become a lawman. And he would do everything in his power to make sure that no one else had to lose a brother the way he had. The stars were coming out now, brilliant points of light in the vast desert sky. Jack rode slowly down the main street, past the bakery where Katie had saved his life, past the saloon where the gunfight had started, past the marshal's temporary office where the future was waiting. He tied his horse to the hitching post and walked inside. Marshal Hayes looked up from his desk, a questioning expression on his weathered face. "I'm in," Jack said simply. "When do I start?" The marshal smiled and pulled a deputy's badge from his drawer. "Right now, if you're ready." Jack took the badge and pinned it to his chest. It felt right, like something that had been missing was finally in place. He looked at his reflection in the window, seeing not just a man bent on revenge, but a lawman ready to serve and protect. "There's a gang operating down near the border," Hayes said, unfolding a map on his desk. "Rustlers mostly, but they've been getting bolder. Burned out a ranch last week and killed a family. I need someone to track them down and bring them in." Jack studied the map, his mind already working through the logistics. How long would the ride take? What kind of country would he be traveling through? How many men were in the gang? "I'll leave in the morning," he said. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Take 2 men with you. And Jack, be careful. These aren't like the Dalton gang. They're meaner and they're smarter. They won't go down easy." "They never do," Jack replied. He left the office and walked back to the boarding house. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new fights. But tonight he would rest. He would eat a good meal, maybe visit Katie at the bakery, maybe even allow himself to hope that life could be more than just death and violence. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Jack heard the sound of piano music drifting from the saloon across the street. Someone was singing a mournful ballad about lost love and lonely trails. The melody followed him into his room, where he sat on the bed and removed the badge from his chest. He held it up to the lamplight, watching the metal gleam. Such a small thing, really. Just a piece of tin shaped into a star. But it represented something larger than himself. It represented law and order in a lawless land. It represented hope for people who had none. It represented the difference between civilization and chaos. Jack set the badge on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, his wounded arm throbbing. He was exhausted, body and soul, but he felt a strange sense of peace. The fury that had consumed him since Danny's death had finally burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner and stronger. He thought about the outlaws he'd killed in the canyon. He'd have to live with those deaths for the rest of his life. But he didn't regret them. They'd made their choices, and they'd paid the price. That was how justice worked in the territories. Swift and final, and sometimes brutal, but always necessary. Sleep came slowly. Jack's dreams were filled with gunfire and falling bodies and the sound of his brother's voice calling his name. But when he woke in the morning, the sun was shining through the window, and a new day was beginning. He strapped on his gun belt and pinned the badge to his chest. Then he went downstairs to find the 2 men who would ride with him to the border. It was time to get back to work. Time to prove that Danny's death hadn't been in vain. Time to show the outlaws and rustlers and killers that the law had teeth. Jack Morgan, deputy marshal, walked out into the bright morning, ready for whatever came next. The last ride to Silver Creek was over, but his life as a lawman was just beginning. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, justice was waiting to be served.